Hello, my name is Mikael Nystrom, also known as the Deployment Bunny. We are going to talk about protecting your important accounts, which basically means your administrative accounts and service accounts. 80% of all the attacks are done using stolen administrative credentials. How do I know that? I work for Trusec, and one of the responsibilities that I have is to help customers recover from ransomware attacks or other cyber attacks, which I have been doing for, I think I've been doing it intensively for almost 2 years. Last year has been crazy. Last month I worked 400 hours. Of that, I spent almost 350 hours on just ransomware attack to try to salvage customers. It's depressing, and I'm here to tell you how to not become that story that we cry on every weekend when we also work. So admin credentials are stolen easily. They are stolen using pass to hash, pass to ticket, or other techniques. These guys are good. They can always find a way to grab your credentials. Every time you log on interactively, you are going to store credentials somewhere, which means you need to make sure that whatever you log on to doesn't save your password. In a way they can get it. That means that you need to be a bit paranoid. It's always good to have just that, maybe this isn't a good thing. Why does it pop up and ask me for credentials? Why should I type that in? Did I do something? If you think that a good password and multi-factor authentication is going to help you, it's going to improve, but it doesn't come as the one and only solution. So credentials need to be protected. That's it. You use them interactively, and you can only use your credentials interactively on devices you trust. And you should trust nothing. So the only thing I trust is actually my own laptop. I also redeploy it from time to time because I don't trust it. It means that using privileged access workstation is the most common way to make sure that whenever I do stuff, it is protected, right? Be aware of the fact that when you are authenticating in the wrong way, you're transporting the credentials and you might be storing them in the other end. So you need to use the right tools, you need to use the right methods, otherwise you're risking a lot. You need to think about all these things. So cloud service admins and privileged accounts, privileged accounts belongs to cloud service admins and identity managers and security admins, and all these accounts are privileged. They can affect a lot of the company, organization, or the company you work for. So that's how you should think about privileged access account. If you have access to Azure as a global admin, that is a privileged account. You can destroy a lot. If you have full access to Intune, you can destroy a lot. So it's not about, that kind of information is important. It's more of if I have access to this, what kind of damage could I do? Because that is what attackers do. They just do damage and then they want money. That's easy. So how much damage can you do with those credentials? Oh, you can do a lot. Okay, then it's a high privilege account and that needs to be protected. It all needs to be protected, not only the account itself. Where is it stored? If your high privilege account is stored in your Active Directory, then your Active Directory needs to be protected. If it's a member of admin groups or somebody can manage those, then that needs to be protected. The person itself needs to, it doesn't need to be protected, but you need to trust the person. Password credentials, they also need to be kind of strong. Workstations you work from, interfaces, they all need to be okay and fine. You can't manage an Active Directory domain from a Windows 7 device. Well, you can, but you shouldn't. And you shouldn't manage switches and routers with a Java interface. They should just roll over and disappear. It's my opinion. Okay, yeah. As an admin you're a member of a private club, and you should be aware of the fact that other persons with other privileged would really like to have your account privileges. So if you're a tier 0 admin, that means you can only work with other tier 0 admins on the same machine. So if this laptop has been used by a tier 0 admin, only tier 0 admin can use that laptop. A tier 1 can never log on to that, or they should not. Or a tier 0 should never log on, or a regular user should never log on, because if you can log on to that machine and you can elevate yourself as an administrator, then you will be able to steal that account. That's very simple. The only thing you need to have is local access. Be smart enough to download a tool, and then you elevate yourself as admin, and then you steal all the other credentials that ever been used on that device. So to prevent that, Microsoft strongly recommends, and we do too, to implement what's called a tiering model, which means that you define administrators and systems into different tiers. Tier 0, Tier 1, Tier 2. Now, when it comes to Azure Stack HCI, Azure Stack, Hyper-V, VMware, we put that in tier -1. We put it in tier -1, we put it in a separate network, in a separate domain, we call it a fabric. It's completely isolated, because if you can gain access to that, you have access to everything. It's extremely easy. The only time it's kind of complicated is when you use BitLocker on the physical machines, BitLocker on all the virtual machines, host guardian services, virtual TPM chip in every VM, and you use TPM chip in every host. That doesn't get installed as many times as I want to. It's just, hey, let's do virtualization. Not good enough. Needs to be protected. So we put that in tier -1. Privileged access workstation, I will cover that later on in another session, but it's basically a workstation that you trust, and on that you run all the virtual machines. It might or might not be protected by a host guardian server. Says demo. Well, this is not going to be a demo right now. The easiest way here is to start implementing tiering for tier 0. Protect your domain controllers, protect everything that has to do with identity. Unless you can protect that, everything else is kind of pointless. You need to protect identity or you're toasted. This is what we mean with, building a fabric. So the fabric here represents everything that is, Hyper-V storage, networking. It's in the fabric, and all the users are in another domain called the rest, the workload or the tenant environment, whatever you want to call it. And there is no link in between. There could be a route in between. There's usually a firewall in between, but there's no account contamination in between. If you have an account in the tenant environment here, you can't gain access within your own domain to get access to the fabric, because it's authenticated using other credentials in another domain. So, making this bigger, this is what we usually build when the customer says, we want to have a ransomware secure environment. Of course, it can't be ransomware secure, but at least it could slow everything down so much that you have the ability to either recover or at least prevent or stop the attack from going on. In this case, we have the fabric. It's an isolated environment, runs in its own network, has its own authentication. That's where we put all the hypervisors and storage. We even have an isolated environment for the backup. It's called a diode-based backup, so the backup goes from the fabric to the backup. But it's another account, it's another authentication mechanism, it requires something else, and it's not going to be using the same account. Cyber crimes and ransomware attackers, the nasty little bad boys, the first thing they do is find a backup. and they are really good on finding the backup, they will eventually find a backup, and then they destroy the backup. Unless they can't get to the backup, they usually give up. Because if they know you have a backup, then you're never going to pay anyway. You could put the management in a separate domain as well. You have the monitor solution in a separate environment as well. Separate doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be another domain. It's just other accounts. The authentication identity engine is something else. It could be Azure AD, it could be a local machine with local accounts or a Linux environment or whatever. It's just not the same Active Directory. It's another domain. And no, there's no trust in between. Isolation, authentication silos, and identity separation and role separation. That makes these attacks slowing down, usually so much that they never launch the attack, and you will find the accounts and be able to prevent bad things from happening. Using tools. Yes, Remote PowerShell is great, Windows Admin Center is great, RSAT, WinRM, WinRS, Server Manager is great. There's one tool I didn't put in the list because it's bad. It's called Remote Desktop. Don't use Remote Desktop unless you know exactly what you do. Remote Desktop is the fundamental hole number one. For the last 2 years, I think that everyone, if I remember correctly, all the ransomware attacks we've been cleaning up the last year, they all were attacked using somebody gain access to a machine, and then they waited for an administrator to log on using Remote Desktop. Then they stole that account and they elevated themselves into becoming a domain admin, and the time frame is usually between 15 to 45 minutes. Then they waited to the weekend, and then they removed the backup and launched the ransomware attack. So it was completely ransomware infected on Monday morning, where everybody came back. Remote Desktop was designed as a emergency backdoor to gain access to a server. That was the original idea with the administrative tool called Remote Desktop for administration. And yet everybody's using that. What I can see is that all these features is actually disabled because everybody turns off Remote PowerShell because it's dangerous. Nobody allows people to run Windows Admin Center because it's dangerous. RSAT tools is dangerous. Everything is dangerous. But then they enabled RDP, and it's like, really? It's the opposite around, my friends. RDP is the one that should go away, and these should be enabled, but secure, of course. I strongly recommend you to shift into a tiering model as fast as possible. It's about downloading the scripts from Microsoft and implement those tierings and moving around machines in Active Directory. And of course also implement a bunch of new group policies. Admin needs training because it's another way of working. Suddenly you can't just have 2 accounts, you need to have maybe 4 accounts, one for each tier and one for your laptop. It's kind of easy. The default tiering is 0, 1, and 2. Most companies will be fine with that. Ta-ta. Maybe you're going to need to have a tier -1 for your Fabric environment. The idea of this is that tier 0 is the highest privileged access account. It's about identity. Everything that controls identity or manipulates identity belongs to tier 0. You need to be a tier 0 admin. As a tier 0 admin, you can only access tier 0 machines, like domain controllers. If you try to use that account somewhere else, you're going to be blocked. Tier 0 also manage all the group policies that affect security. And that's kind of, it's not easy to do, but it's doable. Tier 1 is everything about applications, servers, databases, stuff like that. And Tier 2 is, of course, users and workstations. Things that are not easy to handle with is, let's say that you want to have a backup solution. You want to have a backup agent installed, and you have two ways to do that. You can either install the backup agent as a domain user and give that domain user privileged on each server the agent is running on. That's a bad idea. Don't do that. The backup account should absolutely not be a domain account. The backup account should be a local system or local service or local network or whatever it can run under. It usually works with local system, but never a domain account. That also means that the backup solution now might be like, well, you can't do that because you need to have a domain account to be able to do that. Yeah, then you need to fix that in another way, because running it as a domain user is a bad thing. The attacker will find the account, they will grab the user account, they will grab the password, and they will find all the other machines. They're going to find a domain controller because it's using the same account. Now they're a domain admin. That's how they do it. And they are fast, and they automate everything, and they run scripts, and... Sorry. The idea of having tier 0, 1, and 2 admins. Clean source principle, it's easy. You need to trust whatever you download, whatever you install. You should start thinking about using checksums to verify that the file is actually accurate. We already seen customer being tricked into download patches that aren't really patches, and tools that aren't really tools, and drivers that absolutely are not drivers, and these are enterprise companies. It's on the Fortune 500 list, and they also do things like this. Everything should be joined into Active Directory if possible, but it doesn't mean they should be joined into the same Active Directory. Fabric is one domain, tenant is one domain, backup could be another domain, and so on. I can't spell. If you use RDP, if you must use RDP, make sure you use restricted admin or remote guard. Let's take a peek look on that. So here is one of my admin workstations. It's one of the machines I use to manage my own environment. And I can either access the DCO2 like this, and then type in the name and credentials for this. If I do so, it's going to store the name and credentials in the other end. Now, this is a domain controller, so it really doesn't matter, because if they already have local access to the domain controller, well, then they're going to be domain admins anywhere. But just to showcase this, you can, instead of doing this, use the switch called restricted admin. And if you do, it doesn't ask you. You just log on. It's single sign-on. It's using your authenticated credentials that you have in the machine that you logged on. So I logged on to this machine with the tier I'm using to manage my tier 0 devices on. If I need to manage another tier, I need to log on to another VM or another workstation with another tier level on it. When I'm done with whatever I need to do, I sign out. Okay, so can I use that on every device? Let's try to do this on DCO1. It's going to connect, and then it's going to go like, no, account restriction are preventing you. What? Yeah, that's the thing. This is disabled by default. So the two methods you have is Defender Remote Credential Guard and Restricted Admin Mode. These are the ones that are fine to use. The default one, why did I do that? I better do this. The default one is this. That's the bad one. It doesn't support single sign-on, it doesn't prevent pass the hash, and it doesn't prevent user credentials after disconnection. But this is not enabled by default. It needs to be enabled. You need to run this on every machine. Now, you can do it in many ways. One is to, of course, just run this command. You can run it remotely if you allow remote access to your devices. Or you can use group policy to enable it. and then you can use group policy to enforce all the administrators to actually use this. Restricted admin is something you can use on Windows 7 devices and Windows Server 2008 R2 devices. So this goes way back. Everyone could change this. Now you see there's a little red checkbox. This is access to services from the server. Yeah, there are a few things that doesn't work. And sometimes you might need to do another kind of logon to prevent, to make things work. The same goes for using using CredSSP. Sometimes you need to enable CredSSP, otherwise you can't configure certain things. Especially when you poke around with Windows Admin Center, it's going to nag you and say, hey, you need to have CredSSP enabled. Sure, then you enable CredSSP. Once you're done with whatever you need to do, then you disable CredSSP. And then you might consider changing your password because you just stored your credentials on that machine. And that's bad. So it's not that hard to enable this, but it's not enabled by default. You should use LAPS, Local Administrator Password Solution, and somebody should monitor security alerts. Otherwise, it's kind of pointless. I also have the 10 immutable laws of security. You can check this later, but it's basically rules from the year 2000 that is still applicable. And I haven't seen one customer implementing all this. This is for security administration. And I want you to pay attention to law number 9. Security isn't about risk avoidance. It's about risk management. Everybody really believes that you can avoid risk. You can avoid issues. You can't, but you can manage it. That's what you can do. You need to assume the worst and hope for the best. Otherwise, this is going to be so depressing when somebody calls me on Christmas Day and cries in the phone and go like, hey, we got hit by ransomware. Why did it happen to us? Because the attackers gain access to your environment, and that's it. So when everything is done, we're not done. No, you're not. The bad guys never stop. They're going to find out another way. So this just repeats itself and over again. But a lot of these things that we've seen customers being hit by is well-known security issues. Don't use RDP. The customers we had for the last year, all of them were hit by the fact that an administrator tried to do the right thing. He logged on to a machine and was performing some kind of administrative task. He didn't know that somebody else was on that machine and they stole his credentials. That's why we do tiering, to prevent things from that happening, so the bad guys can't elevate themselves within your environment. That's why we do isolation, because they can't really jump from one domain to another domain, since they don't even know that the other domain exists, and they don't have access to the network, and it's just another environment, so how can they see that being there? But before we end, let me show you Windows Admin Center and how to manage that securely. So switching on to my privileged access workstation. This is a machine that is not even a member of the domain. It's just a workgroup machine. And it's just a demo. Usually it's not configured like this. In most cases, the virtual privileged access workstation is a member of the domain. So, but in this case, just to show you that it actually works perfectly fine for most of the operations, I can manage these machines, DC01, because I specify what account I'm going to use. Where is the password stored? It's stored in the session itself. As soon as I close this web page, the credentials goes away. They're never stored in the other end. So I can manage this. It's going to ask and check that I do have credentials, but it's never going to store it on the other server because I'm using remote access to it, using remote PowerShell. I can't do everything, but I can do a lot. I should be able to manage most of the Windows Server things. I can't install systems. That I need to do with another account. But that's a one-timer, so I can install, and then I can change the installed password, so it can't be used again. Is this complicated? No, it's not. It's actually rather easy. Okay, so what's the problem? It's a change. People need to change. That's the problem. And changing is always apparently a bad thing. People don't want to move. People don't want to grow up. People don't want to get older. People don't want to change because it means you need to put some effort in it. And I agree. Changes aren't that easy every time. And this is the same category. It's not easy. The difference is that this is not really your choice. You just need to do this. Otherwise, the attackers will eventually get access. And when they do, well, let's not talk about that. That's just depressing. So Windows Admin Center allowing remote PowerShell is safe. And the times you really need to do remote desktop, well, if you really need to, let's put up this machine, SRV MDT01, network, local, yep, credentials needed. I'm going to add this just straight up. I haven't connected to it, and I can't use that account, I know that. If I go to manage, I could, in theory, say, use my Windows account and use local administrator password solution with a randomized password. Yeah, awesome. That means that I could use this if I had set this up from the beginning. In this case, it won't work because this is going to steal the local administrator password from the Active Directory, which I don't have access to. So in this case, I really need to use this method instead. But if you do have laps and your machine is joined to the domain, then you can always access the servers using the local admin account. That means that you could do a lot, but not everything. You can't manage clusters. You can't manage Exchange. You can't manage Config Manager or SCOM or things like that. But they could be managed from within the application console. But that means a change. That means change of behavior. That means that everything takes a bit more time. And that makes it secure. So it's a choice. You either make it easy for both you and the attackers, or you make it a bit complicated for you and almost impossible for the attackers. So that's it. Use the right tools, use the right method, get to tiering and start using Privileged Access Workstation. And let's hope that you don't call me on Christmas Day and cry. I will help you, but I just hope you don't do that because I also need vacation. That's it. Thank you.